Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. As I see some of you are connecting to audio, whatever the case might be, feel free to keep your camera on, keep your camera off. This is meant to be somewhat informal, but also enough to provide you with hopefully a lot of information after reviewing all of the different comments that people left for what they hope to gain out of this session. I'm hopeful that you will walk away at least feeling a little bit more confident in what these designation means and where we go from here. And also knowing this is the beginning of a conversation, it's not the end. And we'll continue to have more ongoing touch points. And we are all available to take any additional calls, talk through anything further. Just feel free to reach out to us as always. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but I do have two colleagues that are co-presenting with me, if you will. I'll have them introduce themselves, Derek and Dottie. Derek, go ahead, go first.
Derek Ippenson. I'm the Director of Accountability and Assistant Administrator with Shirley in the Office of Coordinated School and District Support. Nice to see you all.
And I'm Dottie Huisman. I'm the Assistant Administrator for the ESSA Federal Programs team, and excited that you have joined us today. I think you'll enjoy the session a lot.
A lot of hype. I don't know, but we'll try to keep it fun and light for as much as we can. The session obviously is being recorded. Dottie will put in the chat a link to the slide deck, which is view only. So if you want to download a copy or just make a copy that you can take notes for it as you go for yourself, please feel free to do that. And all right, let's get this show on the road. I do ask that while we are presenting that you try your absolute hardest to hold on to your questions because there's a lot of material to cover and it's possible the questions will be answered throughout. However, the chat is always open. Both Derek and Dottie will be managing that. And if you get bumped off, whatever the case is, we do have a waiting room. It's just to make sure that the right people are in the room. And they'll manage anyone who is entering or exiting the Zoom room. And then there was one more thing I needed to mention about this, but I can't recall. So let's get this show on the road. Okay, so thank you for joining us. Oh, sorry, now I remember it. Thank you to all my NDE colleagues as well, and ESU staff developers who are also on. While they might not be directly receiving these designations, I know that they're a huge support for all of you that are here representing schools and districts. So thank you to everyone, and thank you to our colleagues as well that are here. So to kick us off, I want to just quickly acknowledge that we are aware that this is standing between you and a couple of more days before school and school wrapping up at least the 2024 school 2023 year. So we wanted to at least just, welcome some, movement, if you will, and some additional thinking to your brains. What's something you look forward to for the next couple of weeks? And maybe, if you don't want to answer that, what's something you like to make or you like to eat during this time of year? Just to break the ice and welcome you into this learning space today. And don't be shy. If you want to just call it out, that's also fine, but
anything pumpkin, or of course, Rice Krispie peanut butter balls, because those just take me back to my childhood.
Love that. I love it's kind of quiet, so maybe I can get some stuff done and I can actually dedicate some energy around some different projects, spending time with family, anything sweet, lovely. Prime rib. Okay, Dave, come on. I want to invite. Right. So I just want to acknowledge, right, that we are wrapping up this calendar year. I like to think about this time of year as just an opportunity to kind of shed some old skin, if you will, and kind of think about the horizon and think about what are some opportunities that might be coming forward. but I am looking forward to maybe reading a book for just enjoyment instead of an article that's telling me something new or different that I can probably try out or anything like that. So thank you all very much. I hope you're all enjoying each other's comments there, as you will. So to kick it right off, we have some quick objectives, right? After reading the comments, like I shared, thank you all for including your notes around what you're hoping to gain. We want to make sure that we review the federal designation process, both the identification as well as the exit, talk about what are the different requirements. We want to address any questions or misconceptions. And there'll definitely be time for additional questions at the end and sharing some resources and learning opportunities. So then we're just gonna keep going right in here. What I also noticed from reading some of the comments was that I wanted to make sure you understood why you might be here. And if your expectations might be different, hopefully this slide can help adjust that. So I want to make sure that it is very clear that we are talking about federal designations and not AQUES accountability classifications, right? We're going to review the requirements of the federal law. We're going to talk about exit criteria, making sure that we acknowledge and understand the requirements. We're not going to be talking about any future changes or what could happen if something or this or the other. I know there have been some questions about priority schools. That's not happening in this conversation. And we're also not digging into any individual schools, right? So I'm not going to go, oh, let me go to school X and kind of walk you through that data. We will see some data, but it has been modified, so you can't really tell what school it comes from, but it is from some realistic data from school. So why do we do what we do? First and foremost, we have federal and state law that guides and kind of directs sometimes the work that we need to do. State law gives us some statutory requirements around what to include, some deadlines. We have federal law that also provides us sometimes with some deadlines, but some other times it's providing us with you have some flexibility with interpreting this, but make sure you have these types of requirements put in place if a school doesn't, let's say, improve within a specified time frame. And these are hyperlinks, so you're definitely able to click on them and learn more about each law. So first and foremost, it's kind of these things like we have to, but I'd like to think of it as we get to, because it helps us to see kind of how our schools are performing across the entire state. So I said I'm not talking about the classification process, but I do want to point out just a couple of things here, because we've also heard, especially in some of the comments we read, well, I'm a great school, and how is it that I'm identified for something? Or, I didn't exit a particular status. So first and foremost, classification and designations run two different processes, and they're independent of one another, which is why there could be a great school and you could be identified for TSI, ATSI, etc. So we just like to show them side by side because, as you may already know, right, on I believe it was November 22nd when we went public and there was a press release related to the state accountability results. And at that moment in time, right, there was nothing in reference to federal designations. So I just wanted to quickly reiterate that piece here. Specifically for designations, right, as I've already mentioned, comes from the Every Student Succeeds Act. Schools only receive designations. You probably, if your district has a classification that doesn't apply necessarily to ESSA. And then priority schools, while it's a state requirement, it's actually also considered a designation, right? So it's not part of that classification process, if you will, which is why it's coupled over here with our federal designations. But this is all meant to look at a layered continuum of support and like a tiered approach to our support, so you can see how the smaller you go up in the triangle, the more intensive that support becomes. And then just some quick, I apologize for not updating that number there, 2023, but just to give you a quick snapshot, this is all the designations, right? So we just saw this triangle and this is how it breaks down here. So we have our three priority schools. We have 90 CSI schools this year. That is encompassing CSI schools that have not exited from prior years. So maybe they were initially identified in 2018 or 2022. It could be any brand new CSI, meaning they're in the lowest 5% of Title I schools, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. And this also encompasses schools that maybe had a designation in 2019 for a student group, and that student group did not meet their initial year, or maybe they were re-identified for ATSI, and now, because they did not exit, have rolled up to CSI. So that's all of that. And we're going to talk about all the requirements in a moment. I just wanted to visually at least show you a representation of those numbers. And then 257 schools across the state that have a designation of either TSI or ATSI for this year. That number last year was 335, just for a comparison. So the order of operations, if you will, for accountability. The first thing we do is we actually have to do our AQuest classifications. We have an annual statutory requirement that is, this information must be out and publicly available by December 31st. So we were able to do that this year. The next thing that we do is for federal designations, everything starts with comprehensive support and improvement, and that's CSI. We're going to talk about the definitions in a minute. I kind of just want to preemptively talk to you all about how we do this work. Additionally, it's a team of maybe, well, there's one data person, there's Derek, there's myself, there's Dottie, right? So there are many of you on the screen right now that have larger teams than we can ever imagine. And we are grateful that you all have that capacity and that ability. But I also want to put it into perspective when we talk about possibilities of errors or possibilities of oversight or possibilities of maybe miscommunication. At times it's not with any malintent. It is because we are attempting to do a lot, and we acknowledge that sometimes, we're going to just do what we need to do. So appreciate all of your patience and your kindness so far as we wrap up this accountability year. So to put it back into perspective here, we're talking about federal designations. We start with CSI. That is the main and most, if you will, intensive level of support. And it's the one that sets the foundation for ATSI. And then, we look at TSI. Within CSI, we're identifying the lowest 5%. We're flagging any high schools, any public high schools for graduation rate, four-year graduation rate lower than 67%. And then we're applying any exit criteria to eligible schools. So all that happens, and then we're going through the rest of these processes. The other thing I want to note here, that one major piece here to also add into context is that we spent maybe 8 months or so, if not longer, obtaining feedback from various stakeholders across the state related to answering the question, are we over-identifying or are we truly identifying schools that really need the most support to improve, right? So with that feedback, we ended up making some adjustments to our filter process. We'll talk about that in a moment. But prior to even adding all of that filter process, during the draft or the preliminary period that some of you were probably aware that you may have had a designation a month ago, some of you may have just recently found out. The point here is that there was in fact an error that was made, right? So in identifying CSI schools, there were some schools that were erroneously added to the mix. And we're going to go through that in a moment. I just want to preemptively say that now so that you all are aware that our attempt here is to be super transparent with why there may have been a shift in maybe some notification or understanding as to why you may not have known something, or maybe you knew something and now something has changed. But we'll talk about that in a moment, even further. So I've been saying a lot of acronyms. What does it all mean? Here we go. So comprehensive support and improvement. We are talking about the lowest 5% of Title I schools. And these are public schools. All of these apply to public schools specifically, right? So if you're in a special purpose school, Rule 18, non-public, this does not apply to you. But I just wanted to at least share that caveat there. It's also any public high school, like I mentioned, with a graduation rate, a four-year cohort, graduation rate lower than 67%. That is a number that's identified by the U.S. Department of Ed. It's also CSI for a school that maybe had an ATSI designation for 3 years and did not exit. There's one caveat there that there's 4 years if you were identified in 2022, and that's because of some flexibilities we were awarded through the addendum process with the US Department of Ed. The next two are related to student group performance. So if you went on your AQuest report and you saw TSI or ATSI, that means specifically a student group in your school is being flagged for additional support. TSI and ATSI have different comparison groups. You'll see on the left, TSI, it's compared to the lowest 25% of Title I schools, whereas ATSI is compared to CSI. The whole intent of the law is that if there is a student group that in and of themselves would have been flagged for CSI, that should be a huge signal for a school to draw their attention and resources to support the improvement of that student group. Each of these schools are monitored regularly, and it happens throughout a different cycle. Not only are they monitored for federal programs specifically for title, but they're also monitored for any other program that probably many of you know about already, right? So I see Mickey already, so I know that there's other types of monitorings that occur as well. But specifically for this comes from the Office of Federal Program in our office as well. So what does it mean to be CSI? Specifically, breaking it down even further, comprehensive support and improvement, you saw of which there are 90. This is specifically talking to those that are in the lowest 5% of Title I schools. In order to be eligible for this level of support, you have to have a Title I program, right? So the first thing we have to do is ensure that we have all the eligible schools under consideration here. We're looking at performance on the different indicators. On our next slide, you'll see those indicators, which you've seen multiple times before because they're the same indicators, we just do them in a different process. And then lastly, with graduation rate for 4-year, 67% or below is automatically flagged. You don't even have to go through the filter. So a quick reminder of what these indicators are. When we're talking about CSI specifically, we're talking about the performance of the entire school, right? So how all the students that tested in your school performed across these indicators. When we talk about ATSI or TSI, we're talking about individual student groups and how they performed on these individual indicators. For example, English learners, how they performed on NSCAS, ELA, and math, how they performed on Progress or DLP, how they've demonstrated growth on NSCAS, how their reduction in non-proficiency is going down, their graduation rate, their chronic absence, their science proficiency. Just wanted to reiterate that since that was also a point that was made in the registration form. So how did the school actually get identified? So here is the filter process that we use to identify our comprehensive support and improvement schools. I'm going to talk about this even further in a minute, but the first stage is not even listed on here, but it's basically implied in the arrow, and that is whether or not the school is eligible to be under consideration because they offer a Title I program. And do they have sufficient students in that program for that school to be eligible? The third thing, and the most important thing, and which is why we were flagged by some school districts about this error, is that if a school is 2 years or less in operation, they are not eligible for this designation. So I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides to give you some actual numbers that we actually used. But I want to just reiterate that here, that a month ago when those numbers were shared, when a school may have seen their AQuest report, they may have seen something different, and it was because there was a change there. That also impacts the thresholds for each indicator for ATSI. So that's why this is important, and they're connected, and why we're making sure that we're clarifying this right now to you all. The next thing is that, like I said before, we spent 8 months or so getting feedback from various stakeholders, and the word "and" was really pivotal. And what we found is that in order for us to get to the lowest 5% of Title I schools, it would be improbable for that to happen if we did not split this stage up. So what do I mean? That means that we actually took the lowest quarter of growth and the lowest quarter of non-proficiency. You might be saying, surely we did that before. Isn't that the point? Yes, unfortunately, that is what we did before for CSI, and that is what we will continue to do for CSI specifically. And I will clarify that later for ATSI, but I'm talking specifically about CSI. This is the only time where we actually take each indicator separately and then we move forward. So it's possible a school could have high growth, but actually not have low non-proficiency, and then the school will move forward. And that was something that, even though we modeled things in prior years, we did not anticipate and therefore had to make that shift here. Only applies to CSI identification. So what does this mean? We know we have to identify the lowest 5% of Title I schools. We started in stage 1 with 452 Title I schools. However, we have to remove all ineligible schools. I already said schools that have 2 years or less, schools that do not have a title program that have the N size. That leaves us with 427 schools. That means when we go through the funnel, we have to arrive to 22 schools, at least. We could arrive to more, but we need at least 22 schools because that's the lowest 5%. That's all we wanted to identify, and that's all we identified this year. Unfortunately, when we remove those schools, when we re-engage in our calculations again, that actually meant that some schools that maybe weren't identified before were identified now because the pool has gotten somewhat smaller. Okay. So what does this mean? This means also that maybe when you look on your AQuest reports, you may have seen something like this. We've gotten a few emails of like, why does it say this? I'm not sure. We inform every single public school what their stage might be. It might say none, it might say 0 because you don't offer a program. It might say stage 1 to let you know, hey, you didn't make it all the way, but you made it through stage 1. So that could just be useful information for schools and districts to consider, but there's nothing for you to act upon. The one on the bottom is the one that we're going to spend some time talking to in later on. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's it. Sorry. Disregard my last comment. The one on the bottom shows you none. So there you go. So you see an example of what it looks like if you're not in fact eligible at all. And then the same is for CSI high school. This hasn't changed. This was the way we've operated in previous years, where stage 2 has always been a combined score for 4- and 7-year graduation rate. To give you numbers here, I realized I didn't put them on the slide. There were 20 schools that offer title programs across our entire state that are high schools. 5% would be 1 school. That's what we identified, 1 high school. Other high schools that were identified this year were for graduation rate, 4-year cohort graduation rate. Like you heard me say before, if it's lower than 67%, they're automatically flagged. I'm going to stop for a moment. I see the chat, but I can't really read the comments. Is there anything that we need to stop and reiterate or anything? Okay.
No, we're good.
So what are the requirements? What support is provided? What happens if I don't exit? How do I exit, right? Also, I want to reiterate all of this information with the extent of what I may have just shared. The tidbits about the context that I just shared can be found on our aquest.com/resources webpage. For CSI specifically, ESSA does require a comprehensive needs assessment be completed, but there's some flexibility. If you're a brand new school, you do have to complete the entire needs assessment. But if you've already been identified, you can actually select which tenants or domains you would want to focus on. And we have a variety of ways you can engage with the CNA. The intention is that it should be a team approach. We have moved a long way from 2018 when it was, because this is what principals told me, right? When it was a principal in their room completing it because they wanted to get it done, to it actually being a collaborative process that provides data back to the team and areas for growth, and also areas where things are going well. I want to just double down that a identification and designation should not be or seen or feel, although I understand that it is, I know this personally, but it should not be seen as necessarily always a bad thing, but just another indicator for a call to action, and kind of just continue to double down on things that are working, and things that aren't working is an opportunity to shift. We'll continue to provide support sessions like we have in the past. We may attempt something different this year, which is going directly to districts and providing more individualized direction and support. So that bullet 2, which talks about aligning and cohering around district initiatives and things that are already happening, make more sense rather than bringing a variety of different districts together all the time. So that's something that we're looking into for this upcoming year. This also means that CSI schools are eligible for federal funds to support the implementation of their improvement efforts. And I bolded these two because sometimes funds, it's like, cool, I get more money, I'll just buy this thing or I'll invest in this other thing. And it really should be considered and taken into account as, well, what can I invest in that will give me a large return on that investment? We have seen instructional coaches be a really great investment because you're investing in people, upskilling them, and then you're basically creating the type of educator and educators and the conditions that you want and need in your school buildings to ensure success beyond the designation, right? So that when you exit, you continue with that success. And then we'll continue to provide sessions like I've already said. I just reworded it so you see it a different way. To actually exit, this one is a little bit more rigorous, if you will, for the exit criteria because these are identified as the lowest 5% of Title I schools. We want to make sure that it isn't now like the lowest 6% and you just made it over, right? So the case here is that you're not re-identified for CSI. So we go through the filter, not be re-identified, not be in the lowest 10% of Title I. In prior years, that was the lowest 25%. So we adjusted that to ensure that schools feel that you're making progress. We want to make sure that you get awarded for that, if you will, and it counts towards your exit criteria. And the third piece, which is most important as well, is significant progress across all indicators. So the slide where I had the different text boxes of those indicators for CSI schools specifically, each indicator has to demonstrate improvement. When we say improvement, we mean any positive change as compared to their initial identification year. So if I was identified in 2018 and my science status score was 60%, and now I'm going through the filter, I see the indicators, all the indicators have shown improvement, and I see science, it's 65%, but it was 60 before, that's perfect. It could be 61%, that's perfect. Like that's exactly what we mean when we say positive change in performance across all indicators. For grad rate, it's a little different. You heard me say there were a couple of schools this year flagged for graduation rate. These schools not only have to have a graduation rate above 67%, but they have to have had 2 consecutive years of improvement. I've had the question, well, does it mean that the improvement had to be 67%? Not necessarily, but it does have to be 67% for the second year for when they would be eligible to exit. So if that, maybe I can reword it just to make sure people hear me. So if my graduation rate this year is 50%, next year is 55%, and the second year is 68%, I'm eligible to exit. It doesn't have to be 67% every single year. We do want schools to feel like they can exit for making improvement, but it has to exceed 67%. The reason why this is also really convoluted, if you will, is because this thing in the pandemic, right, when it happened, it really deeply impacted a lot of timelines that we had. First, I want to just quickly show you this visual representation of what we're talking about. This might be brand new information, meaning you never had a single designation, and now you're at 23, 24, and you're like, what is this? But this has been happening since 2018, so I wanted to just visually show you that. Right, so we identified schools. 2019-20 did not count towards years in status. 21-22, we did engage in the designations, but we carried designations over. No one was eligible to exit until last year, 22-23. This is for CSI specifically, right? Oh, excuse me, I don't know why that happened. So what we see here is, I just want to draw your attention, the different overlapping cohorts. So last year, which is this like reddish looking color, were identified last year. There were schools that were eligible to exit this year, and some did not. These schools right here that are identified for the first time this year will retain that identification till 26-27. The reason why that is because that is the intent of the law. We are able to allow these other schools to exit as well as low grad. God, excuse me for that spelling error there. The reason why that occurs is because we were able to obtain the addendum from the U.S. Department of Ed that said, hey, these schools that underwent all this tumultuous time during the pandemic, they actually have that flexibility to exit at any point in time. Therefore, they have 4 years, but they can exit at any point in time with the exception of the schools identified for the first time this year. What happens if you don't exit? Well, here we see what the ESSA law calls more rigorous options. Essentially, what we have made that to be is the same language related to our priority school statute, where a school has an option to revise their plan, make a brand new plan, or a school and district can opt to change any administrative structure they like. The school and district can opt to change that. That is not the NDE saying you must or you shall. I just want to reiterate that, right? That is something that is up to that school and district to decide. For those that don't exit, there will be some additional requirements. So like we have done in the past, this past year, not only are you required to complete a brand new needs assessment, we're actually then engaging in some external reviews with some partners that we have related to reviewing classroom instructional practices, reviewing data, engaging in root cause analysis, and then there's this added implementation site visit. So you heard that we monitor every school that's under these designations. These will have an additional visit that's related to, well, how are things actually being implemented and how can we support to make any changes where necessary? Okay. Again, our designation rules have that written out for you. So for TSI and ATSI here, I want to just refresh our brains here. So CSI, lowest 5%, Title I schools. This designation is available to every school, every public school, so long as they meet this N size of 10. So here, and what are we talking about? What student groups? We are specifically referring to the 7 racial and ethnic groups, economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, and English learners. This is the least that the ESSA law has. There are the states that do other student groups. We do the 10 that they outlined as required. TSI and ATSI is a little unique in that this is a district-led improvement effort. Here, the NDE may provide a lot of professional learning. The NDE might, as well as ESUs and our colleagues at NEMTSS, might also offer a lot of professional learning opportunities. But this is really meant to have the school district notify schools, have them support the school in creating and drafting a plan and monitoring the implementation of that plan. No ATSI or TSI school is required to submit a plan to the NDE. You are not required to submit anything to the NDE. However, there are requirements that you must attend to for this designation. So specifically, the plan has to be developed in partnership with multiple stakeholders, has to be informed by all the accountability indicators we've discussed, has to specifically for ATSI, have to conduct a resource allocation review. You probably already do all or most of those things through your continuous improvement plan, maybe your NEMTSS plan if they aren't already the same. Maybe you want to leverage your targeted improvement plan for your students with disabilities. Any plan you're already operationalizing should be uplifted to meet this requirement. you want to just consider which one are we operationalizing the most that people know about that we would want to focus on to ensure you meet these pieces. Shirley will not be like, hey, I'm going to call up so-and-so and see what they're doing. But when we monitor schools, any monitoring that happens from the NDE, there's always a question of, if you have a TSI or ATSI student group, what plan are you using? Can you talk to us about it? U.S. Department of Ed recently monitored us, and they select the districts they want to visit. They can ask you that information as well, right? So the point is for you to just be prepared and be knowledgeable about what you're working towards to meet the designation as required here. So how do you actually get identified? So I'm going to talk through this really quickly. If I just go back a minute, the slide here, the slide you'll see is related to TSI designation. The similar process is happening for ATSI. The comparison group is different. So I just wanted to clearly state that here really quickly. So TSI, the comparison group, is the lowest 25% of Title I schools. We look at all those indicators, okay? The first thing that we do is, are the student groups in these schools eligible? Do they meet the N size requirement? So my example school, Nebraska Middle School, they serve 400 students. If I break them down really quickly, only these student groups meet the N size of 10. Students with disabilities, English learners, economically disadvantaged, Hispanic, and white. They have 10 or more students in this group. So already those schools are eligible. They make it to the first stage. You see the others say exclude. That means they're not even under consideration. We go to the next phase, and here we're trying to figure out, are these students proficient, and or if there are at least 10 students that take the ALPA 21 assessment, are they making progress towards English language proficiency? So then what we see here, we see that after reviewing this data, only 4 of the student groups are still eligible, right? So here we see students' performance compared to the threshold for TSI. These numbers come from the 2023 designation rules. All I'm doing is doing that comparison right there.
Shirley, while we're looking at that slide that was just up there, we have gotten the question, and it might be good to clarify that, like, the Nebraska Middle School English learners group is on there, but that's not just referring to their EL score. That's referring to, like, yes, ELPA is part of it, but it's the academic performance of the English learner group across all of the figures.
Very great point. Thank you. Absolutely. Okay. So for academic progress, you heard me say in CSI, we had to take them separately in order to ensure we get to the lowest 5% of Title I schools. That is not what we did for TSI and ATSI. We did what we received ample feedback and direction from stakeholders, which was they need to be low in both before they move to the next stage. So here's where we are, right? So in stage 2, we see, are the student groups meeting the growth score? Are they low in their non-proficiency score? After reviewing the data, only 2 student groups are eligible to continue on in this designation process. You see students that are Hispanic and students with disabilities did not meet the threshold for non-proficiency. I'm sorry, met the threshold for non-proficiency, or exceeded the threshold. So here you see it's yellow across. So we're going to keep going. Students are identified as English learners, students identified as free reduced price lunch are out of the running for this designation. So then we get to this piece. You saw that, for CSI, I used the combined score here. The same logic that we just did in the previous slide applies, where they have to be low in reducing their chronic absence and low in their science proficiency in order to be identified. So then here we see, in reviewing this data, that actually both student groups end up being identified because they did not exceed the threshold. So then for this specific school, Nebraska Middle School, they're identified for TSI as for Hispanic students and students with disabilities. Now, more conversation could be had at the intersection of a student with a disability and a student who may be Hispanic, maybe how they're performing on their ALPA 21, then we try to see this triangulation, right? So you might just have 1, 2, or maybe even 3, but then you'll want to consider how they look together. So you disaggregate and then you bring together again to kind of see what the implications are for improvement planning and any changes that are needed. Right, so here we are again, I'm looking at 241, oh my God. Okay, here we are again. For ATSI, here we're seeing the comparison group is the lowest 5% of Title I schools. And here you see the arrow basically saying the comparison group lowest 5%. While the words say and, the way we have operationalized these two, ATSI and TSI, and they're stated in our business rules, is together, right? They means you have to be low in both before moving forward. There is a clear distinction on our business rules that for CSI, that is a distinction that we had to make in order to reach the lowest 5% of Title I schools. And the same as for high school. This hasn't changed. It's been like this for the last few years. So what's the difference? Quick reiteration of what we just discussed. TSI is a signal. It happens every year, actually. So you can come and you can exit and enter that status pretty fluidly. ATSI, you're in that designation for 3 years, and it follows the same timeline, at least it should, right? With the exception of the past few years, follows the same timeline as CSI because they're comparing one group to another, and then the additional next steps if an ATSI school doesn't exit is actually CSI. So that's why we wanted to make sure that we make that distinction here. The last, but most not the least, but an important piece is this resource allocation review for ATSI schools, right? That means that there should be some serious consideration given to how time, money, and people are used to support the improvement of the student groups that were identified in your school. So how do we exit, or what happens if we don't exit? Back to the timeline again, I want to just show you this again. We already said TSI happens every year, so you come in and out, which is why there's no cohort, right? But you see for ATSI, there is a cohort. We had 117 schools in 2019. I apologize again. I will, if you're back on January 3rd, a lot of changes, well, a lot of updates. We'll make sure we fix these typos. I apologize. But there were 117 schools and 44 did not exit, right? So that's huge. That means the remainder did exit and did not become CSI schools. So I hope that if you're out there, if you know someone, or if there's schools in your district, I hope that you do make some celebration points there. And for those that are flagged for CSI, ATSI, this is actually a great opportunity to continue to drill down on that student group and see that you are eligible to exit at any time. Okay, so it's possible that next year you might exit the status if you're CSI, ATSI. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Exit criteria, what does this mean? Not be re-identified for that same student group if you're ATSI. And made growth in stage 1. Stage 1 refers to student proficiency and progress towards ELP. Something I'll say in some conversations we've had, there's been a focus on proficiency, and that's wonderful, but to the detriment of progress towards ELP. So we need to make sure that we attend to both indicators, especially if you have students that are taking the ALPA 21 assessment and meet the N size of 10, because you want to make sure that not only they're growing in their performance on math and ELA, but that they're also acquiring English language at the rate that they should be given their initial identification year or their baseline year. And then this is the one that is the newest designation for us as well as for some of you, where how did I get this CSI, ATSI? And you may have seen that on your AQuest report. It says designated as CSI automatic qualification by not exiting group from ATSI. This only applies to the 117 schools that were eligible for this exit. from 2019. So what this means is that the student group either was re-identified for that student group or did not make sufficient growth in stage 1, or both could be true. The comparison here is the school themselves. So that student group from 2019. So we compared how students did this past year to how the students did in 2019 in your school for that student group. I understand they're different students, different context, probably different staff too in some instances. But this is the way that this is written, and this is the way that we have been operationalizing this. Could there be some change in the future? Probably, but that's not this meeting. I just want to make sure we iterate how we got here. So requirements, you'll conduct a comprehensive needs assessment, but there's some flexibility there for how you may want to engage in that since it is student group focused. You'll submit an improvement plan and you'll be eligible for federal funds. And like I said, this designation can exit next year, the year after till 2026. Just describe that exit criteria. Again, it's how you did your initial baseline year compared to the current year that's in question. Okay. And you're eligible to exit every year, like I've mentioned. So what does it mean if you have multiple designations? This is very likely. We have seen that there are some schools that maybe have been identified for CSI low 5%, and they had a student group from 2019 that didn't exit. We're required at the NDE by ESSA to not only do the lowest 5%, but actually do a student group performance for every school, regardless of their designation. So this is how we at times end up here to CSI, ATSI. CSI lowest 5% is the most urgent federal designation. So you'll want to make sure that you're paying attention to that, but that you're also focusing on that student group performance, given that we just said you can exit that year. So you can at least remove one status before you can remove the CSI designation if you were identified for the first time this year. And then, as you have seen already through this entire slide deck, there are many requirements, many timelines. You want to make sure that you are tracking your baseline data in order to determine what progress will need to be made in your individual school and district, individual school specifically, to ensure that the student groups exit. So I want to stop here for a moment, mostly because I'm sure you can all see that I have a blank slide next, so I apologize for that. But I want to stop here for a moment and I want to see if there are specific questions about anything we have discussed so far that you would like any additional clarification on, or want me or my colleagues to talk through anything further. And I'll rely on Dottie and Derek to help me out. I see Melissa's hand, but that's the only hand I can see. Melissa Shorter, do you want to go?
Sure. I just wanted to clarify on that ATSI and TSI, when you're comparing back to the status and ELPA, you said the lowest, is it to the whole group or to just that student group? Is it isolated? What you're comparing back is the lowest 25% of economically disadvantaged, or is it to the overall status score of the lowest 25% of Title I schools?
It's the lowest 25% of all Title I schools.
Not just the group. So then my follow-up question would be, we had in this recent change of data, we had several schools that were from 2019 ATSI groups that appeared again that weren't on the first round of reports. And I know there was changes, but I'm trying to understand if it is actually to that status group. How did it, is it because, sorry about the announcement, is it because the numbers changed in that lowest 25% of status group that all of a sudden these 2019 ATSI groups that showed that they exited before now didn't exit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and Darren, I see your hand up, and I'll read your question from the chat because I'm assuming that's the question that you're asking. He said, we have more ATSI schools than TSI schools. Principals see that cuts are reversed. How do I answer that? The answer is, and whether this is a satisfactory answer for you or not, but the answer is that when we consider ATSI schools, we have to consider the highest performing school in each category, and that can end up being outside the lowest 25%, and so it does look a little reversed, but that is directly from the feedback that we've gotten from the U.S. Department of Education, is that the thresholds for ATSI have to be those best performances in CSI, where TSI is just the lowest 25% of performances in each of those indicators.
So I heard you say we have to. So I heard the Fed said you have to do this. I mean, I think it's a super confusing when we say that, because the bell curve, the tails are supposed to be skinny as we go farther out. So the principals are seeing that the cuts are harder to hit ATSI than TSI. And a little wonky, we have 244 schools ATSI and 18 ATSI. That doesn't seem just a little off. That seems a lot off. So it's just a hard conversation for principals to understand. I'm being helped, you know what I mean? So like, I don't know how to explain that.
So one thing that I have used to visualize this, and it doesn't work, it's not a direct correlation, but if you consider that those ATSI schools probably were going to qualify in the TSI pool, then what you're seeing is a larger portion that are coming out as ATSI and fewer remaining in TSI.
So when Shirley went through the analogy or the workflow for TSI, because that's simpler to understand, it's the lowest 25% in your rank order. We only, for ATSI, when we say the lowest 5%, it's really the CSI schools. I feel like we shouldn't have lowest 25 and lowest 5 because they are two different methodology or formulas. Like I almost feel like ATSI or TSI is lowest 25% and ATSI is highest CSI. We shouldn't call it the lowest 5%.
Well, you're not wrong. It's the lowest student groups based off of the lowest 5% of the Title I schools,
right? Of the total. I just think it's misleading.
I think that's definitely something we should consider about how we name these schools. Like there are many other states that don't even use these acronyms. So point taken around like, why are we stuck to them too? Like we can absolutely consider what the future of that could look like. So I appreciate that feedback, and I hear your point because we just had this conversation today too.
I had the conversation this morning with a school that now is ATSI, and we're looking at the cuts, and I have a 2-column chart. Here are the cuts for TSI, and here's for ATSI. And they asked me, well, then why is ATSI harder to hit? It's a higher bar when it's the lowest 5%. So anyway, it's ongoing in schools.
There is a question in the chat from Mike Mason that says, can we get, sorry, just lost it. Yes.
I got you.
Okay.
I got it.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Derek will be sending out that info. Shirley, there were a couple of questions earlier and about when we would have sessions set up. And I said we were definitely hoping for mid-January, and we would make sure that the schools, the CSI and the CSI, ATSI schools were notified, as well as the service units. So we would get that information out at that point in time. So I don't think I misspoke there, Shirley.
You got it. Thank you. Melissa, I see your hand.
Sure. I just had one other question about the free and reduced lunch student group. Now that we're CEP, I'm worried that these are completely different groups of kids that we're now comparing scores to, because previous to this, your free and reduced lunch would have been your free kids, high poverty students, and then also your reduced students. And now sometimes it's direct certification, which is not necessarily any of those, maybe the highest poverty group. And I can't even figure out how they calculated it on the NEP. We can't get like the exact number. Is this really the directly certified students? Our whole district, sometimes it says 100% on some reports, and for our district, and on other schools, then it's the direct certification. But even put that part aside, as we, and I know this probably doesn't impact everybody, but these are two totally different groups of free and of students that we're trying to improve upon, compared to like if they were identified in 2019 versus the group of kids it is now. And I just think that has thrown a whole wrench into all of this. And I didn't know how other districts are, or what kinds of questions you've had to field about that, because it's very, we have a lot of those groups identified, and it's apples to oranges on who they are.
I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think one of the things I'll say here is that that is an internal conversation we are having around if and what changes would be needed to how we even calculate that, specifically for accountability purposes, but also the implications it has on school finance. So I don't have a solid answer for you, unfortunately, Melissa, but what I will say is that we do, in fact, we have been using that direct certification number, which at some points undercounts kids. So I hear your point where it's like, well, we're not really comparing the actual children because the student group numbers are actually really different. So it's the best of the worst at the moment, but that's not the best answer. But know that we are actively working towards that, and know that we have to do something different to better capture that. Another misconception we hear is that, well, if we do CEP, then automatically 100% of my students, that means therefore my entire school is, eligible for some type of designation, and that's not true. So I just want to make that clear that that is not what we do. But we want to make sure that schools understand that it is a service that they can offer to their school. So don't not do it, right? But more TBD to come. Unfortunately, I can't
Thanks.
say anything further, of course. Any other questions that may have come up or that you're like wondering about?
Shirley, I want to address the statement that was made in the chat about the timeliness of getting these designations in December. We totally agree with that. It's been kind of a rocky road in the last month, just getting some information back from the feds. So the thing to remember is we will be looking at, are there things that you guys want to do, individual schools need to do yet this year to help start making some changes? We get it. If you're going to hire people to help support your lowest needs kids, or your entire school, the point being that, yeah, you can't do it this year. So we're going to do whatever we can, especially if you're a CSI school, it'll be a designation of 3 years. So you can start thinking about what will next steps look like. So that money will continue. Some of that money does continue. So we totally understand the timing it's not excellent. We get that. It's just we really got it to you as quickly as we could, and we apologize for the lateness.
This is Teresa from Columbus Public Schools. I have a question. So when I'm looking at the AQuest report, the 22-23 AQuest report for a school that has an ATSI designation, but it shows that they're in stage 2 of the CSI, but on the district report, it's showing that none of the schools are CSI. Is that an error? Or am I just reading it wrong?
No, you're good. Without having gone in and be able to specifically speak to your school, what we do is we notify every school of what stage they're in, but it doesn't mean you're CSI. So just stage 2 means that that's how far that school may have gone, but you're not identified for CSI. So it's just like a good to know, if you will. But it might not be good to know. I don't know. We just offer it to everybody.
Okay, and thank you. And then one other wondering I have, you probably answered this, but I'm not sure if I heard it. So let's say school A had a ATSI designation for groups of students who were EL and special ed last year, or the previous year, and then the designations that just came out, it is for students who identify as Black.
Mhm.
So does that mean they start over, or they're still, do you know what I mean? Like, where
Yeah.
are they in the stage if it's a whole different subgroup of students?
That's right. So they now are, and this is what I mean by also multiple designations. So the groups that were identified in 2022 are eligible to exit at any point until 2026. The ones that were identified for ATSI this year are locked in till 2026. The exit is still like the timeline, the amount of time you have to exit is the same, except only the original 2 student groups are eligible to exit. 2026 is still the ultimate end date, if you will, to exit those status.
Okay, I think I have it, but I'm a little concerned with one building, so I'm not going to take people's time.
Okay,
I'll just
no
reach out to
problem.
you privately. So thank you.
Of course, Bethany, really quickly, thank you for your question. That was something I was meaning to talk about. I didn't. If you see the slide with the timelines, because 2019-20 did not count towards years in status, when we said, hey, US Department of Ed, we'd love to take advantage of this addendum, they said you have to do something to identify these schools in the following school year beyond 2020-2021, which was 21-22. So we said the option was you either identify a school and they have to immediately exit that next year, or they have to engage in more rigorous options, or you extend the timeline for them and they actually have more time, and then you get back on track the following year. So what we did was, which is why we have the overlapping 22-23 piece there, is that we said we'll identify them and actually give them 4 years versus giving them 1 year, knowing that if you don't exit in the time frame that's identified, more things occur, i.e. you move into CSI, or if you don't exit CSI, you have to undergo these options, have all these additional visits, all these additional requirements. That's why, unfortunately, our timelines are off, but now this year, we're back on where we're all 3 years, the 3-year cycle. Very long-winded answer, but that's where we are.
So next year, we're not doing CSI and ATSI designations again? So
We are
not
not.
until 2026?
That is correct. I know it's 3:04, but I appreciate you all staying as long as you are. I'm here. We'll continue to take any questions or comments you may have, but there are 46 people, Hassan. Thank you. But anything else that coming up? The recruitment. Jonathan, do you want to just voice what you have here? I want to make sure I understand your question.
I'll try. I might be sound like I'm talking through a tunnel. But I guess it's first of all, it's very hard to explain this to the lay user. In other words, when you're talking to a principal, they're already lost when you're on page 2 of the AQuest report. And so we're 50 minutes into a graduate seminar, which you've done a great job explaining, Shirley. But I have a question about the exit target process. Are you federally mandated to recalculate the exit targets every time? Because my thing is this, it's very non-transparent. In other words, and I'll just say it, case study of 2 schools. If you told a school you got identified because your Hispanic students were under this, you walk through the stages, here were all the cut scores, this is the year it happened. If that became the thing that they needed to exceed, like they could see it, But the fact that the thing they need to exceed is a cut score that will sort of get set next year, or, it's, I I just wonder, and maybe you're federally bound, but if the goal was to just leap over the cut score that named them, is that possible, or again, are you federally bound? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I hear that. Great question. We will have to go back and quadruple check all of this. Mostly because the exit criteria is not be re-identified, but then you also have to exceed your past performance. So I'm hearing what you say, well, if not be re-identified is dependent on how me and all these other schools that are eligible for this designation do, I could have exceeded myself, but I will still fall short based off of how everyone else did as well when they're re-identified, because we have to recalculate these numbers. So I can't answer your question straight on, unfortunately, but more to come.
Didn't Christie on the TAC reference criterion reference cut points in which these cuts would stay the same year to year, in which we could tell to principals, hey guys, because almost like in classifications with status, I know 78% of my kids pass ELA and math in the elementary building. I will start off as excellent, and then 54% and so on and so forth. I thought she referenced that there is some, because criterion reference, if I know I need to lose 10 pounds, I have a target and I work towards those 10 pounds. But if I'm just having to go to the gym and I see Jonathan running the track, I'm going to run the track, and then, okay, I better run more than him, but we're doing it at different times. So I don't know how far Jonathan runs. Do you know what I mean? That's what, how this somewhat feels, because I've been working really hard on my absenteeism, and it's going down. But if somebody else, you know what I mean? So I thought that was really smart, and it might be really applicable for principals. Like they could get their head around it and say, okay, I'm going to work towards that.
Yeah, that's the intention of having the CSI be done every 3 years, because then you're not, every year there's something different. The uniqueness is that we now have these cohorts that are eligible to exit because we want them to exit at any point throughout the next 3 years. So we would want to make sure that we hold this target the same, but similar to when we're comparing schools to prior years, we're now comparing schools when they're eligible to exit to the performance of these schools this year, but in the so then it's like, well, is it really the performance? Because it was the performance from this old cohort or this previous cohort. But I'm with you. I want to keep it the same. Okay, I want to make that crystal clear. I do not want a moving target. Ada doesn't help us either when we're talking about creating systemic plans for overall improvement across the state, then let alone how we talk to superintendents and principals and boards about how you might want to fund things differently or create different goals. So
yes. Thank you.
I'm with you. I promise I'm with you. I'm trying my hardest to do everything I possibly can. Bethany, can you help me understand your question a bit more? Make sure I'm understanding it.
So when you were doing the ATSI cuts, did that include only the new schools that had been highlighted for CSI, or did it include schools that were carried over from last year?
So when we
the exit criteria.
Yeah, so when the very first thing we do is identify lowest 5%, and that means every school that's eligible goes through that funnel. And in the end, it does include schools that did not exit already. So that means they didn't meet part of the exit criteria, which is not be re-identified for CSI.
Okay, but only because they were re-identified, not because they were just in there from last year.
That's right. That's right. It's because they were re-identified. That is correct. $310. Just giving you a little time. I'm here. Any other questions? I mean, I can stop recording too if you want to ask some serious questions.